Hey, I'm Decathlon Gamer. Welcome back to Zwift, a fitness journey. We're in New York Central Park today as we ride through. I'm down to that short period of time that I'm available again all this week, really. So it's going to be difficult to get the good rides that I want to get in, and just kind of have to get on with doing what I can do as we take off right from the start here, already on 8%. So it's a decent little climb, but it's a short hill. Well, anyway. Last episode, of course, we had a couple controversial topics, that being Russell v. Bottas and kind of who's at fault. And then, of course, the Super League, which is incredibly controversial. Surprisingly so on how controversial, but anyway. Controversial topics. And then, of course, massive news in the U.S. where Derek Chauvin's been found guilty on all 3 charges of murdering George Floyd. So, controversy. Absolutely name of the game here of late. And so, what we're going to talk about is why controversy is such an issue in the United States and where that's coming from. For those in the U.S., we often don't recognize why that is, but also for those outside of the U.S., a lot of people don't understand why that is. So hopefully I can answer that question today. In the meantime, I'm going to get on with my relatively short ride and just get through. In all honesty, I'm still recovering anyway. Had a rough week in terms of I'm so busy, I'm not getting much sleep. I'm doing 4 jobs right now, so I got just a lot going on, and I got to just keep on with it for another week or so. Let's get to it. There's a reason why controversy is just so damn difficult in the U.S. And to know that and to understand that and understand why we have so many controversial topics that are massive and we just can't seem to come to grips with, we need a brief history lesson. So, as a former history teacher, this is something I've done before, and this is certainly based in fact and not emotion. But this is why it's so controversial to have controversy in the U.S. Dates back to World War II. Now, in World War II, we had an alliance that was some of the members we were happy to have, and some of the members were we were a bit reluctant to be in an alliance with, but it was a necessary alliance. But coming up on the end of the war, you had a U.S. and Russia side both vying to be top dog post-war. That rivalry was already evolving throughout the course of the war, and as the war's end was nigh, that rift was growing deeper and deeper and deeper. Case in point on kind of the final stages of that rift was the atomic bomb. Now, of course, that in of itself is a fairly controversial topic here in these days, but the war in Europe finished quite a while before the war in the Pacific was finished. It was estimated that 1 million plus and potentially up to about 3 million lives would be lost in order to invade and ultimately conclude the war in Japan. And that, of course, was the justification for the use of the bomb. And whether 2 was a necessity or not is a totally separate topic from this. But the release of that first bomb on August 6th sparked an immediate response from Russia, who had been given weapons, ammo, food throughout the war by America and the other allies in promise for multiple things. Also, the invasion of Western Europe was also intended as a relief upon the Eastern Front. So much of that war had to do with giving the Soviets what they wanted, but then also getting in return certain things. Well, among those certain things that were being promised was an invasion from the east, an invasion from Russia into Japanese-occupied territories. And it was never happening. It was never coming. But suddenly, the first atomic bomb was dropped, and less than 24 hours later, the Soviets began their invasion. That then escalated things in the relations between the two, because Stalin was never told about the bomb, for good reason. But he also felt betrayed by that, and in a way was. But at the same time, the Soviets were not keeping up their end of the deal. So you had this rift already formed. Anyway, 3 days later, the war was done. That was really just the beginning of the feud. Now, post-war Europe, post-war Japan, was another hot mess between the Allies. And, of course, that story plays out simply as what became known as the Cold War. It took time for it to fully brew and settle in, but the spark was already there, and it was already really underway, and it just intensified over that next half decade to full decade. But what was born out of this feud and what was born out of the Cold War was a conflict that everyone was quite aware of could result in the use of atomic bombs, which then could result in the end of all life on Earth as we know it. Certainly not the outcome that anybody wanted, either side, any side. Ultimately, in its place was this Cold War, and the whole concept on that was winning on other fronts. If we couldn't actually use a hot war, as in bullets, ammunition, all forms of fighting played out as we knew it in conventional warfare, they went after each other in total opposite manner. It became a war of culture. It became a war of production. It became a war of a race to space, and so on and so forth. Everything became a competition. Aspects of life all became about us versus them. And that is where the United States has such a difficult time dealing with controversy was born out of. Everything has become us versus them. And the U.S. has this mentality of, well, we ultimately won the Cold War, and yes, that's factual concept, that idea of us versus them, and being the winner. The U.S. is obsessed with it culturally. It is so ingrained in our society. And because we have this us versus them concept, well, it bears fruit in so many aspects of our life within the United States. And one of the clear comparisons on the us versus them mentality is our political atmosphere. So many democratic countries around the world have multi-party systems. Sometimes a dozen plus parties make up their government. We ultimately have a two-party system. Yes, the Green Party exists, Tea Party, that there are other elements out there that try to compete. But in all honesty, everybody knows and understands that we have a two-party system, whether you like it or not. And actually a growing number of the population, nearly 50% now, are very anti either one of the parties. But we have a two-party system that, for whatever reason, still holds on and grasps power. So us versus them continues right there into our political spectrum. Hence, the rise in popularity of somebody like Donald Trump is born out of that us versus them. It all exists within those parameters. Included in that, of course, is sport. And we see that us versus them, and that's why the United States became so effective when it came to the Olympics. Was that Cold War us versus them mentality that we've got to beat the Soviets on the other fronts. And so we got so diehard and so obsessive about sports and all aspects of life. And we see that front used primarily through politics. They've embraced the us versus them. There's a reason why those two parties, to the public, seem to despise each other and publicly, through the media, attack and attack and attack one another so regularly. But behind closed doors, they're great friends. Not all, but many of them are great friends. The majority of our politicians, at least in Washington, but even at state level, so many of them get along famously. But they use that us versus them as the political motivation to earn their votes, to keep their position, to do what they're doing, and ultimately to, arguably, blind the population to what's really going on. It's not about whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or liberal or conservative. It's a class warfare thing. And the one thing that they all have in common, majority anyway, what the politicians have in common is that they come from a wealthy background. And they have the same vested interests about money. That is what destroys everything below it. And they're just using people as a pawn, and they use issues as pawns to create strife against each other. And it works so well. Our media runs with it because the same people that are involved so heavily in those politics are the same people that own all the media companies and dictate what ends up on the news. Time after time after time, individuals quit their jobs in the media and go rogue and go separate because of these very issues. Well, anyway, without getting into all of those details, that us versus them mentality is there. Also, and this is another piece that absolutely contributes to why the U.S. is constantly engulfed in controversy, is this. All the way down to our education system, we are taught to be polite. We're taught to have good manners and respect others. And in doing so, we're also kind of taught that sometimes lying is okay if used in the right manner. For example, if your mother asks you, "How do I look in this dress?" the appropriate response culturally in the U.S. is that they look amazing, that they look good, they look nice. Mom, you always look nice. That is supposed to be the answer. That is always supposed to be the answer. So we're taught to tell what we call little white lies. Curious that word is part of that. But that is our cultural demand, that we be polite. And that's so that it's okay to tell a small lie as long as you're being polite. And as long as it's necessary for you to be polite and not be rude. And so we're often not honest with ourselves about those little things. But those little things bleed over into big things. Now, the reason why this whole topic is even brought up, of course, is with Chauvin being found guilty on all 3 charges. And an issue in the United States, a controversial issue in the United States about the Black Lives Matter movement, about racism in the U.S., systemic racism in the U.S., and all of these topics. Now, without going into what my opinion is on any of these topics, the reason why that there's still issues and why there is different beliefs in such a matter is that we can never come to terms with these issues and actually discuss them with fact-based evidence to reasonably sort out our differences. Because culturally, like I said, we're told to use the little white lies. And ultimately, when it comes to a controversial topic, we label them as taboo. We don't talk with our kids about them in the education system. We are strongly frowned upon for talking about them. I was a teacher for 10 years. I got in trouble every year for bringing these topics up, and other teachers refused to bring them up, and my administrators refused to allow me to bring them up, and I got in trouble when I did. That is the way our education system is built. We can't talk about the issues. We talk about the things that have already been settled. We talk about the things that happened in the past. We talk about how to settle things, but we don't actually practice it because we do have controversial things. And because of this us versus them mentality, we're passionate
about our us versus them issues. And so we develop an opinion on a topic, which is not always fact-based because we speak emotionally. Speaking of, let's go back to our topic from just 2 days ago, the Super League. Most of the people who are adamant about how terrible the Super League is, most of them are speaking entirely based on emotion and not actually talking about the substance of what was going on. And that's what I tried to get into last time, was what is the substance? What are they actually trying to do? And looking at it, it really wasn't that bad. I don't care necessarily one way or another whether a Super League happens or whether after just over 48 hours it ceased to exist. Officially it doesn't cease to exist yet, but with 3 members, it's not going to do very well with a 3-member league. Though if Barcelona and Real Madrid want to go play themselves along with Juventus every day, fine by me. Better competition than what they face now, considering they've got about 17 out of 20 teams in their league. Well, okay, let me reassess that. 14 out of 20 teams in their league are utter garbage, and then, they've got a few competitive teams. There's a reason why I don't care for that league, and there's a reason why I like the Premier League, and there's a reason why, on that same hand, I'm not totally opposed to the idea of a Super League if it doesn't interfere with those others. And FIFA was the only reason why it would have interfered with those, and that was all just emotional reaction. Crazy, ridiculous, passionate emotion, but neither side was using any reason in their arguments against each other. And then I watched some YouTubers that I love and adore and who put out great, reasonable, well thought out commentary, and then just listen to them rant in those last 48 hours about how much they hate the idea. But their rant, none of it actually talked about anything to do with the league, just how offended they were that the 6 Premier League teams were even thinking about doing such a disgraceful thing. Well, anyway, that's kind of the point that I'm talking about, is we in the US have this consistent issue of anything that others don't agree with, we use emotion as our base for the argument. And we don't argue with reason. And we certainly don't listen to those who argue with reason, and we respond emotionally. Or at least that's the tendency. That's the culture. And so all of this comes down to America's got a real problem with that us versus them, which was born out of the Cold War, that came down to, when it comes to a controversial topic, we don't talk about it. We don't have proper discourse. We don't break it down and use reason to compare and then judge accordingly. We just don't talk about it, period. And then, as people get into their late teens or early 20s and finally start to care a little bit about the world and go, oh, right, there's this world going on around me, and man, oh man, there's actually some important things going on, and I'm starting to pay attention to them. But then we hear a passionate argument that does not have evidence, that lacks reason, is just passion. And then we agree with one set of emotions or another, whichever one rubs you the right way or rubs you the wrong way in terms of what becomes the opposition. And so many times the issues become more aligned with what somebody else feels, and then you just adopt those feelings, and we fall into that trap over and over and over again. And so what we're faced with is a scenario where, thanks to a group of politicians in Washington, both sides, in all honesty, we're faced with a scenario that they just attack one another with that emotional thing over and over again, and it just trickles down into all aspects of our life. So what's born out of a way that our government is structured, we have a scenario where now within our own country we're divided on everything, whether it's fandom for a team or fandom for a sport or support for real issues, race relations or class relations. And instead of finding a way to sort out our differences and to get along, we just continue on this path. And we continue to go forward, always picking an us versus them in anything and everything that comes along. I mean, even in your ice cream brands, people will passionately fight over their favorite ice cream. And as absurd as all of that sounds, it's so culturally ingrained that it's nearly impossible to avoid. And now that my wife, for example, born in the Philippines, did not enter the lower 48 of the U.S. until 8 years ago, she's been here long enough that she is ingrained into that culture as well. And she has that same mentality and that same attitude. Now, as an educated person who taught social studies and has kind of gotten to the bottom of that and was fortunate enough to live outside of the country for a few years, I'm able to reflect upon that and recognize that and step away from that. But even then, it's not always. There are times where I still fall into that trap and I still get passionate about that. And I still do that largely in sports. I'm still very passionate about my Oregon Ducks and diehard fan, and the way I used to talk bad about other teams, now I've kind of limited that. I've slowly brought that down to just a couple of schools that I really, really, really strongly don't like. But otherwise, I tend to find a way. The way I cope with all of this is, instead of hating all others, the thems, right, in that us versus them scenario, I really try to pick out an individual. For those who are my cycling fans, you know who the individual is that I have strongly picked out of this last period of time, this last half decade or so. And that, of course, is Tom DeMoulin. He's the one where I focus my angst so that it's not more widespread. Now, that's the way that I cope with it. I still do it because it's culturally ingrained in me, and I was raised that way, and that's how I am. But anyway, when it comes to controversial topics, we can't just get along and we can't respect others, because everything is dealt with emotionally and passionately. And when we have those emotions and we have that passion in topics that we know next to nothing about, and we certainly don't know the other side of the story, we don't know where others are coming from, it's real hard to respect that. That being said, I must say, as a final point, Chauvin being found guilty, only the first step in a long road to recovery from an issue that has plagued this country for its entirety, really.
Alright, everybody. That's completion of the loop. That's completion of this one. I know controversy is controversial and all, but I don't see why everybody has to be so afraid to talk about issues. Let's see if we can move forward as a group, as a world, and actually talk about things that matter. I'd love to see that. Anyway, that does it for this one. Here's some difficult, short, punchy ones here on this loop, which I forgot about. I didn't finish last time out, but that's another short ride for this week. It'll be another short one on Friday as well. Well, I guess Saturday for you, and next Tuesday for you, until I get back to normal. I'm Decathlon Gamer. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to hit the like button. See you next time. Have a good one. Be safe out there. Goodbye for now.